On the bright, crowded market morning, a rich man decided to build his own good name on the back of a poor woman's ruin. The wealthy events and gift house owner who controlled the guild the whole settlement was licensed through stood up in the middle of his gift house before the gathered market, pointed at a poor young woman who carved and burned decorative calabashes by hand for a living, and told them all that she was a cheat. He said it plainly, so that every trader browsing his stacked polished gourds could hear him, that this stall woman had taken his money for hand-carved calabashes and instead passed off cheap machine-stamped factory gourds as her own handwork, that she had disgraced his house before his guests, that she owed back her deposit and heavy damages, and that he had finally caught her at it. Ijeoma Nwafor did not weep, and she did not beg, and she did not run, though his men were already pulling her calabashes off her stall, and the murmur of the market was turning against her. She stood in the bright sun with a worn commission logbook held flat against her chest and a small hooked carving knife in her other hand, the same book in which she had dated and sketched and measured and photographed and thumbprinted every calabash of every order she ever took on, and let his accusation break over her. Because there was nothing a poor calabash woman could say into that powerful man's stall that the frightened traders were ready to hear against him, and the gift house owner performing his outrage did not know that the woman he was so sure he could ruin held, flat against her chest, the one thing able to turn his own accusation against him, and that within days a government standards officer would put a hand lens to those very gourds before this same crowd, and it would show, plainly, which calabashes were the cold machine fakes and whose hands had pushed them in, and how long after they left hers. The market did the thing a crowd does when a big man with power names a small woman a cheat first. It drew back from her. The traders with their own stalls of goods, the loaders, the people who had come only to buy and sell and go home, looked at Ijeoma in her worn craft worker's apron, standing over her stock spread on the ground, and took their cue from the man who owned the biggest event hall and half the guild, because a powerful man's certainty is contagious, and it is always safer to draw back from the accused than to stand beside her. A few of the older market women did not draw back. They frowned and looked at the carved gourds, because they knew what it was to make a thing with your own two hands all day, and be the first blamed when a big man decided he did not want to pay. But most of the market went with the chief, because that is how a fraud is made to look like justice. You get the crowd to agree the poor woman is the cheat, and then no one thinks to ask whose hands really made the fakes. And Ijeoma felt the heat climb up her neck and the book press hard against her ribs. And inside her, quiet under all the noise, the one thing the accusation could not reach. She knew what she was. She had carved and burned calabashes honestly for years, dated and photographed every order in and out, delivered every piece exactly as her own hands had made it, raised her young cousin on the thin margin without begging or cheating, and never once sold a gourd she had not carved herself. She lifted her chin the way her mother had taught her over a workbench when she was small, and said nothing aloud, because a woman who has made honest things with her hands in a market full of big men's names has already learned that the loudest stall does not decide whose hands did the making. The gift house owner thought he was managing a small nuisance the way he managed every nuisance, by deciding who was low enough to be ruined, and doing it from a stall where no one would argue. He had looked at the carvers his house commissioned, seen a stall woman with no shop of her own and no powerful name behind her, and decided, long before that bright morning, that she was exactly the sort of unknown little worker he could rob quietly and, if the swap were ever noticed, brand a cheat to carry it for him. He had spent his whole comfortable life seeing in people like Ijeoma not what they made honest with their hands, but how much of it he could take and pin the loss on them. Ijeoma Nwafor was 28 years old, and in that settlement she was known by nearly everyone and truly seen by almost no one. The Calabash woman. The one who carved and burned decorative and ceremonial gourds at a small stall and sent finished pieces out for weddings, hotels, and title ceremonies. She rose each morning before the settlement filled, in the single rented room where she lived with the younger cousin she was raising, and set to work, laying out the day's gourds on a clean bench, curing and scraping each one, drawing the design in soft pencil, then cutting it with her small hooked knives, and burning the fine lines in with a heated iron so patiently that a calabash carved by her hands was known up and down the lanes to be honest work, every cut true and every piece one of a kind. She earned a thin margin for the slow handwork, taking so slight that one bad week, a customer who paid late, a slow season with no ceremonies, could leave her tin nearly empty. She was, everyone agreed, honest and skilled, and she had learned long ago that being poor and gifted with your hands at once only meant people used your careful work and forgot your name. The Calabash woman, they called her, half in fondness, and most of them did not know the half of what she carried, nor what one big man's gift house had been quietly planning to cost her. She had not been handed her trade. No one hands a poor woman a living. She had built it herself, over years, the way the poor build anything that lasts, slowly, with sacrifice, and with far more discipline than the comfortable ever imagine. She had learned to carve gourds at her mother's side, who had done calabash work for the gift houses before her, and when she found herself alone with a young cousin to raise, she had made that knowledge into her whole livelihood. One workbench, one set of hooked knives, an old pyro iron her mother had left her, and a name for clean, honest carving that spread slowly from lane to lane. She saved what she could in an old tin toward the one thing she wanted in the world: to lift her cousin out of the thin corner of that rented room and into a life with a proper roof and school fees paid without fear. She used to think, burning a fine line into a gourd in the early light, that a reputation for honest hands was the one thing no one could take from her. And under it all she kept two things she had never fully explained to anyone: an old pyro iron and a worn commission logbook. Her days were long, and they were the same, and there was a kind of pride in the sameness. She cured and scraped and drew and cut and burned, piece after piece, because a woman known for honest hands does not send a great house's order out with a cut gone wrong or a line left crooked. There were good weeks when the ceremonies came thick and the tin filled a little, and lean weeks when a season passed with no weddings and she counted her coins twice and fed her cousin first and herself after. But she did not complain, and she did not cut a corner, and she never once passed off so much as a single factory gourd as her own handwork. Because a poor woman's honest name was not a thing she traded when times were hard. It was the one thing that stayed hers, no matter how hard they got. That was the woman the chief looked at and saw a nobody he could rob. Because there had been, from the very start of her trade, a slow and careful habit Ijeoma kept that set her apart from every other poor carver in that settlement. She had understood, the way a person who makes things for powerful people comes to understand, that the day would come when a big man decided he did not want to pay for what he had ordered, and the poor hands that made it would be blamed for something to give him his excuse. Any other carver might have shrugged that fear off, or trusted that honest work alone would speak for her. But Ijeoma did two quiet things instead. First, she kept her commission log faithfully. Every order she took on, before she cut a single line, she dated the page, measured and sketched the gourd, wrote down what was agreed and what deposit was paid, and had whoever commissioned the work press a thumbprint on the page beside the date. And then, as she carved, she photographed the piece at every stage on a cheap phone, the raw gourd, the drawn design, the half-cut, the burnt lines, the finished calabash, and dated each picture so that she held in her own hand a running record of exactly what had been ordered, from whose hand, and exactly how her own hands had made it, step by step. And second, she had learned, over years of cutting and burning by hand, to no true handwork from a machine stamp on site. The way a hand-carved gourd carries slightly irregular knife cuts that vary bead to bead, the warm scorched grain and tiny burn halo a hot iron leaves, the faint pencil ghost lines under the cut, no two pieces ever alike, where a machine-pressed gourd is dead uniform, cold, with no burn and no ghost line. Every piece a twin of the next, because a woman who lived by her hands had better be able to tell a real carving from a factory copy in the dark. What had first set her to it was a thing she saw, years before, when she was still new to the trade. Another carver she knew, a gentle older woman named Mama Afone, who had done calabash work for the big houses for 30 years, was accused one season of taking a hotel's commission money and passing off cheap machine gourds as her own carving, and was turned out of the guild for it. Her name broken, her small custom gone, and Ijeoma, who had watched Mama Afone's honest hands for years, never believed for one moment that the old woman had done it. She watched a lifetime of careful work destroyed by an accusation the old woman had no way to answer, because Mama Afone had only her word and her tears, and a poor carver's word is nothing against a big house's claim. And something turned over in Ijeoma's chest that never turned back. She understood, watching that gentle woman shamed, that the danger in her trade was not a slipped knife or a slow season. It was the day a powerful buyer decided to keep his money and needed a poor hand to blame. She could not unbreak Mama Afone's name. But she went home and began her commission log that very week, and started photographing her work stage by stage, and kept it faithfully from then on, because she could not unsee what she had seen, and she was not built to walk into a trade full of powerful buyers with nothing but her word to hold up when the day came. Here is the very thing this channel was built for. So let me say it to you plainly before we go on. If you have ever made something honest with your own two hands for a powerful person who takes as a matter of course, poured your careful work into it, handed over exactly what you promised, and kept quiet careful proof, because you sensed that one day someone powerful would call you the cheat, then you already belong here with us, under the Baobab. Take one moment to subscribe to Baobab Tales, because the quiet, overlooked people who make honest things with their hands while the powerful plan to rob them, and who keep the one small proof that turns it all around, are exactly the ones these stories are told for. And I do not want you to miss what a rich man's lie was about to do to Ijeoma Nwafor in that crowded market, or what one cold iron and a photographed log were about to do right back. To understand the woman standing accused in that market, you have to understand the man who owned the gift house. His name was Chief Obinna Achebe, a wealthy hospitality and events magnate in his 50s, who had built a great fortune out of event halls, and a gift house that outfitted the weddings and title ceremonies of half the city, addressed as chief by everyone who needed to take a commission through his guild. He was not, to look at him, a wicked man. He sat at the head of the Artisans' Guild and gave to his church, and was forever spoken of as a pillar of the trade, the big man who could put a fitting carved calabash into any celebration in Lagos. But under the rich agbada and the heavy beads and the easy public warmth, he was a man who had never once imagined he could be in the wrong, and who measured every person near him by what could be taken from them. The genuine hand-carved calabashes his house was famous for supplying he had, quietly and through his agent, been faking for years, commissioning real handwork from a poor carver, buying cheap machine-stamped gourds on the side, and, whenever he wanted to pocket the deposit and duck the balance, swapping the factory pieces in and branding the carver who made the real ones a cheat who had passed off machine junk. The cruelty in that market did not come from a criminal in the shadows. It came from a respectable big man who had turned the very craft of an honest trade into a fraud stall, which is a colder and more dangerous thing. And the thing that made Ijeoma dangerous to such a man was the one thing he had never thought a poor carver would possess, a proof of exactly how her own hands had made each piece. For the whole fraud rested on a simple certainty that the poor could never prove the work was truly theirs. The carvers his agent framed had no dated log, no stage-by-stage photographs, no thumbprint on a page. They had only their word that they had carved the real ones. And a worker's word is nothing against a big house's loss and its claim that the delivered pieces were factory fakes. Chief Obinna had built his robbery on that helplessness. He had never imagined that among the carvers his house commissioned there was a quiet stall woman who had been dating and photographing and thumbprinting every order for years, who could tell true carving from a machine stamp on sight, and whose log held, in his own agent's thumbprint, the record of the very calabashes he meant to call fakes. He looked at Ijeoma and saw a nobody. He did not see the receipt she had been keeping against his lie. The morning the sky broke came bright and busy, word already running through the market that the great gift house had been cheated. A season's grandest title celebration had been coming for a chieftaincy family, and Chief Obinna's house had been engaged to supply the carved calabash gifts and centerpieces for it and, as his house so often did, had put the real handwork out to a poor carver on commission. That carver was Ijeoma. She had taken the order on as she took on everything, dated the page and wrote what was agreed, measured and sketched each of the fine large ceremonial gourds, took the deposit, and had the chief's own agent, the man who brought the commission, press his thumbprint on the page beside the date, as she made every customer do. Then she had carved and burned each calabash by hand over many days, photographing every one at every stage, raw and drawn and half-cut and burnt and finished, each picture dated, and delivered the whole order to the same agent, thumb-printed out, exactly as her own hands had made it, and she had thought no more of it than of any careful job well done, until the market woke that morning to the news that the calabashes the great house had set out for the celebration were cheap machine-stamped factory gourds, and that the poor stall woman who had been paid to carve them had cheated the chief and passed off factory junk as her own handwork. It was the wrong thing to be blamed for in a rich man's market, because what had happened between her stall and the celebration, Ijeoma did not yet know, but would soon prove, was this: the chief's agent, taking the genuine hand-carved calabashes from her hands, had carried them not to the celebration, but to his master, who put the real carvings aside in his own store, set out cheap machine gourds bought in bulk in their place, and let the guests see the factory pieces. And then, when the moment came to pay her balance, the chief had his story ready before anyone could ask a question. He did not wait to be accused of setting out cheap gourds. He went out into his gift house that bright morning, before the whole market, and he branded her. He told the gathered market that this stall woman was a cheat. He said that she had taken his commission and his deposit, and instead of carving the calabashes by hand as she was paid to, had bought cheap machine-stamped factory gourds and passed them off as her own handwork, disgracing his house before his guests at a title celebration, and that the little book she was said to keep was nothing but a cheat's trick to look careful while she robbed her betters. He said she owed back her deposit and heavy damages for the disgrace, and that he was within his rights, as the guild's own head, to seize her stall against it. And he gave the word, and his guild men pulled down her stock and spread her calabashes and the fake machine gourds out on the market ground in front of everyone, turning them over and holding them up as the proof of her cheating. And they made a show of her ruin in the bright sun. The poor cheat, caught at last, her factory fakes spread for all to see, and the awful machinery of it turned, not an engine of steel, but the older machinery, the one that turns an honest poor woman into a cheat the instant a rich man needs one. Ijeoma stood in that bright market among her spread calabashes and did not break. When they pulled down her stall, she did not throw herself down after it, and she did not scream, and she did not curse him. She stood very straight, with the commission log pressed flat against her chest where his men had not thought to grab it, and her small hooked knife still in her hand. And she let them make their show. Because she understood something the market did not. She understood that a man does not spread a poor woman's work on the ground, calling it fake, unless he is terribly afraid of what an honest test might show. His loudness was not strength, but fear, wearing strength's clothes. And she said, once, clearly, so that the older women at the edge of the stalls heard her, that she had dated and sketched and photographed those calabashes at every stage as she carved them, that his own agent's thumbprint was on her page for the order, that she would ask any officer with the authority to simply examine the gourds and read her log, and that a man who feared a poor woman's photographed record had something to hide. Then she gathered what stock she could from the dust, took up her knife and her book, and walked out of that market with her chin up. And behind her the chief told the crowd he would be bringing her before the guild and the authorities to have her fined and banned, which was the proudest, most fatal mistake a cheating man ever made. Because in his certainty that a poor woman could never prove the work was truly her own, Chief Obinna did the one thing that would destroy him. He called in the authorities himself, to make his ruin of her look like law rather than robbery, and to frighten every other carver into silence. He reported Ijeoma to the Artisans' Guild, and to the Government Crafts and Standards Office, as a cheat who had passed off machine-stamped factory gourds as hand-carved work and defrauded his house, and demanded a formal hearing to have her fined, her stock forfeit, and her name banned from the trade, summoning the very officer whose whole work is to assess whether workmanship is genuine hand, craft, or factory make, and packing his own market with traders to watch the poor cheat condemned. He was so sure the machine gourds would damn her that he invited the one authority on earth able to put a hand lens to a calabash and say exactly how it was made. He thought he was calling witnesses to her shame. He was calling them to his. This is the moment the channel was built to make you feel, so sit with it for one breath before we go on. Because if you have ever been called a cheat by the very person who was robbing you, and been so sure of your own honest hands that you longed for someone with real authority to simply come and look, examine the work, read the record, match the thumbprint in the open, where no big man's shouting could bend it, then you already know exactly how Ijeoma's heart rose and shook when she learned that the chief himself had summoned the standards officer to his market. If you've made it this far into Ijeoma Nwaofor's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Word of the coming hearing traveled the settlement fast, and it reached the ears of a man who had been waiting a long, quiet while for exactly this. His name was Pa Emeka Okonkwo, a retired master calabash carver in his 60s, who had spent his whole working life cutting and burning gourds and judging genuine handwork against factory make, and who had come, in his retirement, to live near the settlement and watch, with a professional's slow anger, the way the poor artisans of that place were framed for frauds done above their heads. He had suspected the great gift house's dealings for a long time. He knew that a house which keeps catching its most valuable commissions faked by a string of unrelated poor carvers, one after another, is not being cheated by the carvers, but by someone inside its own doors. But suspicion is not proof, and a retired man with no standing could accuse no one. What he had needed was a worker with a record and a reason for the officer to come. Now, on the same morning, he had both. He sought Ijeoma out where she was sorting what stock she had salvaged, told her plainly who he was and what he believed, and asked to see her commission log. And when she laid it open before him, dated entry by photographed entry, and showed him the very page where the chief's own agent had pressed his thumb for the calabash order, the old man's hands went still, and his eyes filled, because he saw at once what she had built without quite knowing it. Not a helpless certainty, but a case, dated, sketched, measured, photographed stage by stage, thumbprinted, and his to help her prove. Pa'ameka did not take her case from her. He did the greater thing. He taught her how to make the officers see what she already held. He explained what her commission log was. A dated, photographed, thumbprinted record of exactly what her own hands had carved, step by step in the chief's own agent's thumbprint, so that it could be laid against what had actually been set out at the celebration, and show precisely where the real carvings had been switched for machine gourds. And he explained the test that would turn it from her innocence into his crime. That a calabash does not lie about how it was made. Genuine handwork carries slightly irregular hooked knife cuts that vary bead to bead, the scorched grain and tiny burn halo of a hot iron, faint pencil ghost lines under the cut, and no two pieces ever the same. A machine-stamped gourd is dead uniform, cold-pressed, with no burn and no ghost line, every piece a twin of the next. The seized fake calabashes, examined under a simple hand lens before the whole market, would show themselves for the cold factory gourds they were, while her photographs proved, stage by stage, that the real carvings she had delivered were living handwork made by her own hands. The proof of her innocence was also the proof of his fraud, and hers was the only record in that settlement clean enough to lay it bare. And so, on the day the chief had chosen for her condemnation, the market filled. Traders and loaders and neighbors packed around the grand gift house in the bright hard light. A long trestle set out for the hearing with the seized fake calabashes and Ijioma's spreadstock laid out on it like exhibits. And Chief Obinna Achebe, moving among the crowd in a fine agbada and his heavy beads, greeting the government standards officer with the warmth of a man certain of the verdict, the fabricated damages notice folded in his hand, ready to be confirmed. He had summoned this. He had staged it. He wanted the whole settlement to watch the poor cheat broken by the law. He did not know that the plain retired man standing quietly beside the stall woman had once been a master carver, judged the finest in the trade, or that the photographed log under her arm and the hooked knife in her hand were about to turn his own hearing into the instrument of his ruin. The officer, a careful government examiner with no stake in the settlement's fear of the chief, did what such officers do. He ignored the shouting and went to the calabashes. And the first thing he asked for, before any accusation was read, was a good light and a hand lens. He took up one of the seized fake gourds, a calabash the whole market had been told was a cheap factory piece the poor woman had passed off as her own carving, and turned it slowly under the lens. And the pattern on it was dead identical all the way round, each unit a perfect twin of the last, the lines pressed cold and shallow into the shell, with no scorch and no burn halo, no pencil ghost line beneath, no living variation anywhere plainly, past any argument, a machine stamp. Then he laid that gourd beside a calabash of true handwork and put the lens to it. And where the machine piece showed dead uniformity, the hand-carved one showed the slight honest irregularity of a knife guided by a person, the warm scorched grain of a hot iron, the faint pencil lines still ghosting under the cuts. A factory stamp against a living hand, past any argument, and a sound went through the packed market, not a shout, but a low, cold intake of breath from 100 people who understood, all at once, that a machine gourd set out at the chief's celebration did not prove the poor woman had cheated anyone. It only proved somebody had swapped her carvings for factory pieces. And the question was suddenly, terribly, whose, and to be certain, the officer did not stop at one gourd. He examined a second and a third, and each seized fake betrayed itself the same way, dead uniform under the lens, cold pressed, no burn, no ghost line, while every calabash Ijeoma could show a photograph for carried the living irregularity, the scorched grain, the pencil ghost of a true hand. The whole seized order, the officer said flatly, was machine-stamped factory make, and not one of them matched the honest handwork in her photographs. And then he turned to the question the chief had not wanted asked. If the set-out calabashes were factory gourds, when had the real carvings become fakes? Before they reached the poor carver's hands, in her hands, or after they left them? And for that, the officer turned to the only dated, photographed record in the whole affair, Ijioma's commission log. Then the officer, with Pa Emeka at his shoulder reading the entries in the plain language of a man who had carved calabashes his whole life, laid the commission log open on the trestle and read it out to the market. He read the day the order came in, what was agreed, and the sketches Ijoma had drawn of the fine ceremonial gourds she was to carve, and beside the date the thumbprint the chief's own agent had pressed when he brought the commission. Then he held up the phone and showed the dated photographs, one after another, of each calabash as her own hands had made it. The raw gourd, the penciled design, the half-cut shell, the burnt lines, the finished piece, living handwork, photographed stage by stage as she carved. And he read the delivery entry, the day she handed the finished carvings back, thumb-printed out by the same agent. The log showed, past any denying, that Ijoma had been commissioned to carve, and had carved by her own hands, and had delivered genuine handwork, every stage of it recorded, thumb-printed both ways by the chief's own man. And then came the blow that turned it from her innocence into his crime. The officer had the calabashes actually set out at the celebration brought and compared to her photographs, and they did not match. The living hand-carved pieces the agent had signed for on his way out of her stall had become, somewhere between her hands and the celebration, the cold machine gourds now lying dead under the lens. The carvings had not been faked in her stall. They had been switched, after they left her, on the chief's own side, by the chief's own agent, whose thumbprint proved he had carried her genuine handwork away. And then, to close the trap the chief himself had sprung, the officer and Pa Emeka pressed the question of where the real hand-carved calabashes had gone. Genuine ceremonial handwork of that size does not vanish into the air. It is far too valuable and far too distinctive. Quiet inquiry through the guild, which Pa Emeka set moving the moment he saw the case, had already turned up the trail. The great gift house's own store, where fine hand-carved calabashes matching the sketches and photographs in Ijioma's log had lately been seen set aside, and a bulk order of cheap machine-stamped factory gourds that traced straight back to a supplier paid by the chief's own house. Called to the hearing, that bulk purchase and the sight of her own photographed carvings in his store pointed straight at the chief and his agent, the same man whose thumbprint sat in Ijioma's log, on both sides of the order. The shape of the whole machine stood open now before the market, the great house commissioning real handwork, the agent switching it for factory gourds, the real carvings kept back to sell as genuine, and the poor carver who made them branded the cheat. A thing his house had done, Pa Emeka said, not once, but again and again, to one poor carver after another who had no photographed log to save them. And other carvers began pushing to the front now. Mama Afone, the gentlest of the trade among them. The old woman turned out years before for a fake swept up beside the very same house, and the settlement understood, all at once, that it had watched not one cheat, but a long line of honest hands broken to cover a rich man's fraud. And then came the public accounting, the part this channel does not skip, because a fraud undone in a whisper is no justice the world can see. The officer, before the whole packed market the chief had gathered to watch her shame, declared the set-out calabashes to be machine-stamped factory gourds, declared the genuine hand-carved pieces switched after they left Ijioma's hands, and set aside the damages notice as a fabrication. Every calabash she had been commissioned to carve, he said, she had carved by her own hands and delivered exactly, just as she had always said, and the fake the chief had claimed she owed for was his own fraud, not hers. and Pa Emeka, permitted to speak as a master carver who had served the trade his whole life, told the market in flat, merciless plainness what had truly happened. That Chief Obinna Achebe had built part of his fortune out of robbery, commissioning genuine handwork only to have his own agent switch it for cheap machine gourds and keep the real carvings to sell, branding one honest poor carver after another a cheat to pocket the deposit and duck the balance, and had done it to this one the moment her honest hands came near proving it. The market that had drawn back from Ijeoma in the bright sun now turned, as one, and looked at the chief, and it was a look no amount of money could buy back. Chief Obinna, who had come to see a poor woman fined before an admiring settlement, and instead found the ground opening under his fine shoes, made the last mistake of a man who has never been contradicted. He tried to bluster over the officer, as he had blustered over the stall woman, protesting that he knew nothing of what his agent did, that the woman and the old man had somehow faked the test, that the calabashes had been genuine when they left his house. But it was too late for that in a market that had just watched a machine gourd lie dead uniform under the lens, and heard his own agent's thumbprint read off both sides of her log. A man who has spent years insisting the poor could never prove the work was their own cannot. When the record is read and the factory stamp shows in the open, pretend to be its victim, and the officer, who answered to the standards register and not to the chief, cut across his protests with the flat authority of a man who has examined 1,000 pieces of work. The gourds, he said, are machine-made. The record is clear. And this, he said, lifting the fabricated damages notice from the chief's own hand, is not a fine. It is evidence. And the consequences did not stop at the market. The agent who had carried the carvings, switched them, and set the factory gourds out, was arrested and charged with fraud, with obtaining by false pretense, and with the seizure and destruction of Ijeoma's stock, and the trail of the bulk order and the hidden carvings, once the police pulled it, ran back through him, and into the chief's own house. The guild stripped Chief Obinna of the office he had used as a weapon, so that he could no longer stand as the trade's authority at all. And the greater ruin came the way it comes to such men, through the trail of dealings they were so sure no one would ever read. The hotels and fine families across the city did not care to be seen beside a man exposed for switching the handwork entrusted to his house for factory junk, and framing the poorest workers in his own trade. Orders were canceled, partners stepped back, his name became the thing traders warned each other about. He was ordered to make restitution, to restore Ijeoma's hand-carved calabashes, and to repay, from his own pocket, every carver his agent had framed, and every deposit he had pocketed, and every stall he had wrecked. Ijeoma first among them, and Mama Afone, whose name he had broken years before, cleared and repaid at last. He had put the blame for his own fraud on the hands of the poor to grow rich, and the record, read honestly at last, named the real cheat, and left him with nothing but a borrowed good name gone. For Ijeoma, the turn was not a windfall so much as a door, the world forced, at last, to admit what her hands had always been. Her name was cleared before the whole settlement that had watched her shamed, and cleared not by mercy, but by proof, which is the only clearing that truly holds. The restitution and the repaid commissions became the capital she had never been able to save, and she made of it exactly what everyone who had ever trusted her careful hands might have guessed she would: a proper calabash craft house. No longer one woman at a small stall, but a real, growing concern, a clean workshop, proper benches and lamps and irons, and in time other settlement women she trained and paid to cure and draw and cut and burn to her honest standard, every commission dated and photographed and thumbprinted in and out. The houses that had drawn back from her came to send work to her gladly. She took what she earned and did the one thing it had always been for. She lifted her young cousin out of that thin corner and into a real home, a proper roof, school fees paid without the old fear. The honest hands she had nearly been ruined for were hers again, and worth more now for having been spread on the ground before the whole settlement and found, examined, and photographed, and read, to be exactly what she had always said they were. And Pa Emeka, who had waited so long for a worker with a record and a reason for the officer to come, found in the aftermath the work his retirement had been missing. He and Ijeoma did the thing that turned the whole story into something larger than the two of them. Knowing how a single powerful house could quietly rob 100 poor workers who had no way to prove the work was truly their own, they set about arming the settlement's other small artisans with the very things that had saved her, to keep a dated, photographed, thumb-printed commission log for every order, to photograph it stage by stage as they made it, to learn true handwork from a machine stamp under a simple lens, and to know their right to bring a disputed piece before the standards office. It was not a glossy foundation with ribbons and cameras. It was a plain, stubborn passing on of one poor woman's hard-won receipt to everyone still working under the same sky, so that the next time a big house switched real handwork for factory junk and blamed the hands that made it, there would not be one Calabash woman with a photographed log to catch him, but a whole settlement of workers who knew how to prove exactly how their own hands had made a thing. And on an evening months later, when the new Calabash craft house was swept and quiet, and the benches stood clean under the cooling lamps, Ijeoma sat among her carved gourds with the old commission log open on her knees, and her mother's small pyro iron resting in her palm. No longer a frightened woman's secret receipt against a fraud she could not name, but the proof, kept and honored, that honest hands and a true record held quietly through the lean years are stronger, in the end, than a rich man's name on another's ruin. Her cousin slept under a proper roof, in a real home her own two hands had at last been allowed to build. The grand gift house she had once been shamed before stood quiet and diminished, its switched carvings restored, and its head disgraced. And the crowd that had drawn back from her in the sun now came for the Calabash woman's own honest work. The truth had come out at last, and the woman they had branded a cheat was in the end the one whose hands the whole settlement knew had carved every piece exactly as she had always said. And so the fire burns low under the old Baobab tree. Tell me, before you go, when the powerful pass off their own fraud onto the poor hands that made the honest thing, and one honest woman's quiet record is what finally shows whose hands did the making, do you believe such cheating is always caught in the end, or only in the stories we tell under the tree? Stay a while, and tell me in the comments where you watched from.